This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast. I'm your host, Brian Whitney. A native of southeastern Illinois, Jack Harrell moved to Utah and joined the Mormon Church at the age of 21. He currently teaches writing at Brigham Young University, Idaho. In addition to teaching, Jack has published several articles with Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, and Sunstone magazine. Jack has also published a novel titled Vernal Promises and a fiction collection called A Sense of Order and Other Stories. Part personal memoir, part philosophy, and part creative writing advice, Writing Ourselves, Essays on Creativity, Craft, and Mormonism, explores the relationship between Mormonism and the writer. Mormons see the universe in mythic proportions. Their God is a creator, their devil a destroyer. This makes meaningful conflict fundamental to their worldview, and begs the terms for religious redemption, as well as the redemptive power of art. Harrell urges writers to be authentic as they embrace the difficulties inherent in the creative process. His essays blend faithful intellectual inquiry, personal narrative, research, and application to offer insights for anyone who cares about writing, creativity, and the human condition. In this episode, we interview Jack Harrell. So you began Writing Ourselves with an essay, a very personal essay titled The Little Pink House. You wrote about your memories that were both traumatic and fond, and you conclude with your entrance into writing a paper for a college English course. First, I'd like to ask, what made you want to launch into this book with such a candid essay?
Well, I thought that it would be important for readers to get to know me a little bit before jumping into these essays about creativity and the writing process and so on. And I guess because my background isn't what some people would think a Mormon's background is, I thought it would be important to talk about that too. And, you know, things have changed over the past couple of decades. There's that I'm a Mormon series that the church has put out where you see some guy who works on Harley-Davidson motorcycles and it turns out he's a Mormon, and all of these different kind of backgrounds. So I think we're better at seeing now that not everyone is this sort of cookie cutter kind of background. But I just thought it would be a way for people to know where I'm coming from personally before we get into these essays that have things like, you know, a works cited page and stuff like that.
I suspect that there are many who are going to listen to this podcast who don't consider themselves to be writers. Can you talk a little bit more about the therapeutic power of writing?
Well, I think it goes for readers as well as writers. There's a great movie from, I think it was the 1980s or 1990s. It's called Shadowlands, and it was about C.S. Lewis, and it was kind of semi-biographical, and it's about his meeting his wife, Joy, and what he went through with her dying of cancer and so on. And there's a character in that movie, a kid, a student of C.S. Lewis's, and this kid quotes his dad, and his dad had said, "We read to know we are not alone." There's a lot of truth in that. You pick up something, you start reading it, and one of the things that happens is you start to find out, wow, this character or whatever has experienced what I've experienced or has felt the way I feel. And so there's this connection there, and that's very gratifying, very therapeutic to find out, wow, I'm not the only person who feels this way. And maybe that's part of just kind of opening up in a therapeutic kind of way. I think it applies for readers as well as writers. I'm really a believer in the fact that this happens in all kinds of fields, and maybe it's kind of silly to separate high art from low art and so on. I think I can even imagine somebody who's making a quilt for the county fair and is coming up with an original design and so on, going through very much the same steps and the same processes that a poet might go through writing a sonnet.
Can you summarize your theory of the creative process for our listeners?
So really that essay, it came out of an experience I had of, I'm kind of a done some amateur woodworking kind of thing, and I wanted to build a stereo cabinet for our stereo and for my record albums. And I had this idea, that was the conception, and then things got complicated because what my wife was visualizing in her mind in the conception process and what I was visualizing wasn't the same. And then I came to more complications when I realized, oh, well, I don't know how to do these complicated joints in the wood. I just know how to do these simple joints and all kinds of other things with the fasteners and the shelves. And I met with limitations on what my ability was. And so that was this complication. And then we got to the point where we thought, okay, this can't be done, or at least can't be done with the equipment that I have and the ability I have. And that was the wall. And I think this is really an important step or an important phase in the creative process. This barrier has in it the seeds of the solution if you can just see what's going on. And that's what happened when I was building the stereo cabinet. I realized, okay, my own limitations that make me feel like I can't do this project, I can actually use that to come up with my solution for how to get through this. And then finally, you have the final stage where, in this case, I had a stereo cabinet to put my record albums in. At the conception stage, you think, oh man, this is going to be great. Except you don't have anything. You just have an idea. Some people think if I can just come up with a great idea, then everything else is easy. But I don't think it's that way at all. Ideas are easy. The problem is trying to flesh one out and make it real. So at the beginning, you've got this great idea, but you don't have a real thing in the real world. But it's really exciting at the beginning. And then those stages of complication and wall and so on are really discouraging. And that's where you just want to quit. But you have to keep going, even though it isn't really any fun. But then you get through the other side, and now you have the joy again, like you had at conception. But you've got the joy, and you also have a thing that you made. So I think it's interesting that there's kind of a bookends of joy in the process, except for the first one is joy, but there's nothing. The last one is joy, and you have a thing that you made that you can be happy with.
And then the other thing that I was thinking as you were saying this is how similar this seems to be to like the Fowler 5 stages of faith and the development of faith, going through that challenge process of faith and emerging from it. Seems to be a similar path.
Okay, yeah. Now, I'm sort of familiar with Fowler, but I don't know the stages. Can you say what those stages are?
I probably won't be able to name them all independently, but I know that it begins with a very simplistic, literal, concrete view of spirituality, of religion, and then a challenge, right? The conflict rises. Then the anguish going through that, then a breakthrough happens.
Well, what I like about that comparison is, especially at the beginning, this kind of black and white, childlike thing. So this simplistic view, I've got a great idea and now I'm good to go. It seems to me like, the world is simple and black and white, and my faith is true, and I haven't been challenged, and I don't even know challenges are coming,
Well, let's switch topics a little bit here and talk about gratuitous violence in literature. You wrote in your book that before readers even pick up a story that they know that there's violence in the world, even senseless violence. What they want to know is that somehow, despite the violence, despite the senselessness, it's worth the effort to keep the world spinning for another day. I really like how you worded that. Can you articulate your thoughts on violence as a stabilizing force?
Well, I'll say first that this came out of my teaching, having student writers come with their short stories to class and having this just senseless violence because they're new at writing, and somehow they think that we need to have something really awful happen for there to be conflict. But the irony of that is, if there is just this power of violence and it's not countered by something else, then there is no conflict. And, I've got to say this, it's sort of connected, I think, to pornography. In pornography, there's no conflict because the guy walks in, the woman takes her clothes off, everything just goes without any tension, without any conflict, without any complication, and it's gratuitous, and it's also not the way life is, where you have two people who are agents, they are individuals, they have their wants and needs, and those play off of each other in this balanced kind of real human way, So with the violence, if you've got some of these slasher horror movies, I don't know, maybe we're over that era where this guy just kills a bunch of people and nothing can stop him. And therefore there's no conflict in it. And so it's not good art because there's no conflict, there's no tension. We do know we're going to die. We do know that awful things can happen. It may even be tempting if you just watch the news all the time and you never turn it off and go out for a walk in the beautiful world, it just seems like everything is awful. And crime is everywhere and people are awful. And why would a person want to go on in a world that's like that? And so what we want to know is that those villains are out there, but we also want to know that there are not only some heroes who are willing to fight that, but there are things that are worth fighting for. And this may be a tough sell for some people, but to say the force of good is at least equal to the force of evil or decay or destruction. And so this makes me want to say something about just the opposite of this. A story that says life is glorious, everything's wonderful, sunshine all the time, flowers and roses and butterflies, and there's no such thing as darkness. I think those are just two sides of the same coin of bad art.
And I think that this works well into the next topic that I wanted to cover, which was your essay titled Telling the Truth, Teaching Creative Writing to Mormon Students. In this essay, you asserted that if a person believes that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is God's church on earth, the question of negatively implicating the church in one's writing becomes very significant. So we have this caution about how far we're willing to go to discuss exactly what you're talking about, the balancing forces between good and evil, or the negativity that inevitably happens in life. And there's this guarded we have our guards up, right?
Yeah.
To not wanting to take that too far because of the negative implications that it might cast on our faith. Can you articulate your thoughts a little bit more on this?
Well, yeah, and I think our desire to be good representatives of the church, it's a good desire. We do want to stand as a witness, and we do want to say to people, or at least I do, this church means the world to me, and I would love it if you could share in the joy that I have had being in this church, and I would love to invite you into that. And yeah, I don't want to say, hey, come and look at our dirty laundry, in a way that would disparage the church or make somebody not want to be a part of it. But then at the same time, as soon as I say that, something I realize is that our neighbors who know us, our non-Mormon neighbors who know us Mormons, they already know we have dirty laundry, They already know that, oh, this guy, he's in the bishopric and his daughter ran away from home. or something like that. And so on the one hand, we want to kind of protect and keep this unpleasant stuff from getting out there. But on the other hand, what we need to realize is most people probably know anyway. People see our faults, maybe even better than we do. Still, the question comes, when you're trying to portray things, when you're trying to tell the truth, how do you do that in a way that's, I guess, artistically responsible, and it also makes you feel that you are doing right by the church? There are people who are kind of wringing their hands with glee as they tell the story of a priesthood holder who's a pedophile or something like that. And in that sense, then, I guess we can't go into every writer's heart and know their intentions, and maybe we shouldn't even try to do that. But we can certainly look within our own hearts and say, if I do feel like the story that I need to write right now is a story about a priesthood holder who's got problems or whatever, then what is my motivation for doing this? I really believe in the redemptive power of art. I kind of think that art is like atonement with a small a, that we have in our lives. There are all kinds of things happening all the time, all kinds of crazy stuff, all kinds of non-related stuff. And in art, you try to take all this stuff and you try to put it together and make it into something coherent. And that act of trying to make it coherent, you're trying to build something, you're trying to make something, and you're trying to take maybe the chaos of our existence and form it into something coherent. You're trying to put back together. And that's what makes me think of this idea of atonement.
Coming in July from Greg Kofford Books, Boadicea, The Mormon Wife, Life Scenes in Utah, the second volume in the Mormon Image and Literature series, edited and annotated by Michael Austin and Artis E. Parshall. First published in 1855, Boadicea gives us a glimpse of the Mormon image and literature immediately after the Church's public acknowledgement of plural marriage. Originally written by Alfreda Even Bell, a prolific author who worked at breakneck speed to imagine the lives of a strange people, filled with stories of polygamy and polyandry, along with a generous helping of adultery, seduction, kidnapping, and no fewer than 14 untimely but spectacular deaths. Boadicea will be available July 12th. Visit gregkofford.com for more details. You wrote an essay titled Making Meaning as a Mormon Writer on the influence of philosophical tensions between deterministic and nihilistic paradigms. Now, we kind of discussed this already in some of the earlier questions that you had, but I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about the influence that these views have on writers, and in particular Mormon writers, because we do have, as Mormons, a pretty deterministic perspective. Can you talk about some of these influences and how they affect us?
Yeah, I think that the nihilistic thing is probably not a big problem for Mormons, because we do believe that the universe matters and there's meaning in the universe and so on. So the thing that's a temptation for us is a deterministic view. And I agree with you that many Mormons have this deterministic view, but I don't. And to me, this all hinges on agency. And if agency is real, then there's a risk that I may go the wrong way and I may use my own agency to my own destruction. So I believe in that kind of universe where our choices are real, they have not been decided already, and we can change, and we can go one way or the other. To me, what this means for story writing, I think there's a connection between the Mormon writer who is like this deterministic God who's decided the final score of the football game before kickoff, and then he just forces his characters through all these moves to their wonderful salvation, and it's a lousy story because there's something kind of fake about the story all the way through. To me, there's a connection between a kind of a God who allows for the agency of his children and a writer who allows the characters to make their own mistakes and grope and find their own way and maybe even fail. And the thing is, this is almost a quote from, you know who Eugene England is, right?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, Mormon literature, great BYU professor. And he says something about you have to let your characters fail, and you have to even love your characters as they fail, just as God loves us. Or I think he says, just as we would love one of our friends who is making decisions that we disagree with. And so to me, that's a much more authentic paradigm, and it makes a connection between how we see God and how we see agency, but it also resonates with what good art does. While on the other hand, this deterministic God who's pulling all the strings and knows everything, there's something kind of false about that. And I think we see that in lots of Mormon stories and lots of things you would find in the popular Mormon bookstore.
And this is all building together, everything that we've discussed so far. You're talking about agency of the characters that are being written. We're talking about philosophical tensions between determinism and nihilism. We're talking about the self-editing that goes on from Latter-day Saints, and obviously from people of all backgrounds, but it's particularly strong among Latter-day Saints. But this is all building together towards what you call a Mormon literary theory, or what you propose anyway, as a possible path for a Mormon literary theory. One of the possible frameworks that you offered in there is an alignment with a couple of current movements, and I'm somewhat versed in literary theory. I did take a literary theory, just a 400 level class. Found it extremely interesting and also extremely aggravating at the same time, but I enjoyed it. And one of the movements that you refer to is, well, actually, the movement you refer to is postmodernism, or as it's also called, new sincerity. I'd like you to take a moment to explain what that literary movement is and how it ties back into your views of where Mormon literature could go.
Okay. So I want to give a disclaimer first. I was talking to a friend just the other day about these things, and he pointed out that no literary movement has its name when it's in the middle of it, right? It gets its name 5 or 10 years down the road. And maybe this is even some wishful thinking on my part. What is happening now is just kind of in some new stages, and the names keep changing, and things are kind of fuzzy. But my view of this, or what I can kind of figure out with all this, is in the 80s and the early 90s, things were really hopping, and there was all this deconstruction, all this postmodernism, all of these other things happening, feminist stuff and Marxist stuff and so forth. But really, the main kind of heart of all this was the deconstruction stuff. So we can take any text and we can find within that text the kind of the seeds of its own unraveling, or this set text says just the opposite of its theme, and so it kind of breaks itself down, tears itself apart. Well, it seems like now in the 2000s and now the 2010s, there are a lot of people who are saying, okay, so you can take anything and you can dismantle it. And then what do you have when you're done? You've got just a bunch of dismantled stuff. And that's not very rewarding, There's a really good book. It's in that series. There's a series called A Very Brief Introduction to, and there are all kinds of topics. And One of them is called postmodernism. And he talks about this issue, and he says the problem with the whole postmodern perspective is that in the end, you've taken a bunch of things apart, but you don't have anything. And in life, that's not very rewarding, because we actually would like to have a career, buy a house, run for mayor. We actually would like to accomplish things and do things. And the postmodern deconstruction kind of thing doesn't allow for that. And so the idea with this postmodernism, new sincerity, one of the big kind of names in this is David Foster Wallace, who talked about these things and who said, we can take all of those things and that's all great, but it's time to start once again thinking about building things, believing in things, valuing things. And that's kind of where this is at. And I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if in 10 years or 20 years we'll look back and we'll say, yeah, that's what the movement was and that was the new thing. Or if this is just some little rumblings here and there, but it's not going to come to anything. So I do know one problem in academia with all of these feminism and gender studies and all this. It's almost like everybody's gotten converted in academia, so there's no more tension anymore because everyone believes. And no one who's a conservative dares to say, is there another way to see these things? And this is very ironic. This same movement that said we've got to diversify and we've got to give voice now may be saying you have to believe like us, and if you don't, you can't speak.
That seems to hold true for whenever a movement that has been persecuted rises to the level of where it's prominent. Right. So you think of like early Christianity, for example, as it was persecuted under Rome and by the Jews who saw it as a separatist fringe movement. And then eventually, as it rises to prominence in Rome, what does it do? It persecutes its former persecutors.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously. I hope that our listeners have too. I hope that they'll pick up Writing Ourselves, whether you are a writer or whether you are a reader. This book can be a tremendous asset in challenging your worldview and showing you the potential of creative output, but also just the potential of resolving us to be truer to ourselves, more authentic, more genuine in our expression and our openness. Thanks for coming on the show, and we look forward to the release next Tuesday.
Okay, you're welcome.
That was Jack Harrell, author of Writing Ourselves, Essays on Creativity, Craft, and Mormonism, available in paperback and ebook on June 14th. Pre-order your copy today at gregkofford.com. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to our podcast through iTunes, Google Play, and other podcast feeds. Be sure to like us on Facebook to stay up to date on the latest news about our authors, releases, and promotions.